say you've finished a row or gotten almost to the end and you happen to look back and you see that you have a mistake back at the beginning of the row and you want to rip back to it. New knitters often find this traumatizing and worrisome, so because they don't want to drop stitches or make a mistake with the stitches. So I want to show you just a really simple way of ripping back a row stitch by stitch. So I take the tip of my left needle and I insert it from front to back through the stitch below the next stitch on the right needle, because of course I'm ripping backwards, so I'm working off my right needle here. So I insert the tip of my left needle from front to back through the loop of the center of the stitch below the needle I'm trying to take off, and then once it's secured I take the stitch off. So again, it's front to back through the row below. Once that stitch is secured, I take the stitch I just knit off. Front to back, front to back. So this secures one stitch at a time and is just a very safe way of ripping back without worrying about dropping a stitch. Okay, so if you've just missed a stitch or dropped a stitch on the row below or the row you're working on, it's really easy to work back stitch by stitch to fix that error. But if you discover that you've made an error an inch or two deep in your fabric, it's too slow to go stitch by stitch to get back there, and to try and work down too many rows worth with a fix a stitch if you're new to knitting can be difficult. So in a situation like that where you discover a mistake several inches below where you're working, my recommendation is either decide you don't mind it and it's a design element as opposed to a flaw, and then just keep going forward. Or if it's going to bother you, it's time to rip it out. You know, if it's going to bother you, you're putting a lot of time into making this, do it right. So I want to show you how I would rip out, just to be careful, because you don't want to rip out wildly. You don't want to be like a bull in a china shop, because you don't want to make things worse. So I take my needle out of the stitches. I'm going to hold with the palm of my hand the fabric, and I'm just going to gently, row by row, pull out, and I pull straight off, not at an angle. If you pull at an angle and you're working with something catchy like mohair, you can make kind of a knot. And particularly if you are ripping something like mohair or that has any texture, don't pull quickly and hard. I just find that these sort of gentler little tugs are a little bit easier to pull out a yarn that has a little bit of texture. So straight out, not at an angle. Don't go wild like that. It works okay with this yarn, but if you have a yarn with any texture, it's better to just do gentle little tugs. Okay, so now say we're back to the row. We've just ripped out the error, and now we want to pick up our stitches again. So I usually find a needle that is smaller than what I've been working on, okay, because it's just easier to get that into the stitches. So say I was knitting this on a US 9, I might grab a 2 or a 3 or a 4, anything smaller. Even an 8 will be easier than picking up on a 9. Okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go pick up my stitches, and ideally you want to pick them up from the back to the front. If you're working from the right to the left, which I'm doing here because I'm right-handed, you want to pick the stitch up from the back to the front, okay, not the front to the back. So if, however, I'll pick one or two up front to back so that you can see the difference when we get to them. All right, so you see how simple this is. I'm keeping the weight of the fabric on the table, and I'm just being very gentle. Make sure you have some quiet time. There aren't kids and dogs and cats running around likely to jar your workspace. But it really isn't difficult, particularly if you grab a smaller needle. It's very easy to pick those stitches up. So now that we've picked the stitches up, and we've picked them up onto a smaller needle because it's much easier to get the smaller needle through those loops without splitting them, and with less aggravation. But now that you're going to start knitting your fabric again, you need to remember to pick up the needle size that you were originally working with. So that's an easy thing to forget. So try to remember that. Now what I want to do is I want to work over to show you how to fix some of those stitches if in fact when you picked the stitches up with the needle, you picked them up in the wrong orientation. So I'm going to knit over to that spot. And again, the correct orientation for the stitches is to have the loop that's to the front of the needle be slightly to the right of the loop that's on the back of the needle. So let me knit over to find one, and it's usually pretty obvious when you come to one that's wrong. Okay, so do you see here now this stitch is on in the wrong orientation. And that's a really common error when picking up stitches, to have picked it up in the wrong orientation. So one simple fix is just to take the tip of the right needle through this loop and then just reorient it on the needle and then knit it in the regular way. Here's another one that's on in the wrong orientation. The other way you can handle these is just to knit them through the back loop. It just sort of saves a step. You just knit it through the back loop. Now this one's on correctly, so I'm just going to knit it as usual. So whenever you come to one that is in the wrong orientation, either knit it through the back loop or just reorient it. Very simple.